Texas, 1944. When the medical transport trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Hearn, the Hungarian soldiers inside braced themselves for what they believed would be their final humiliation. Among them was Laszlo Kovacs, a 26-year-old farmer from Debrecen who had lost his right leg to American artillery near the Danube. His stump still throbbed with phantom pain that had haunted him through 3 months of capture, transfer, and uncertainty. As the truck stopped and American medics approached with wheelchairs instead of clubs, Laszlo whispered to his fellow prisoner, "Maybe they want us mobile before the execution." Istvan Molnar, the man beside him who had lost both legs in a tank explosion, managed a bitter laugh. "At least we'll die sitting down." Neither man had any idea he was about to witness something that would redefine his understanding of both war and mercy. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we retell the forgotten human stories of war. The afternoon sun blazed over the converted Texas ranch as 12 Hungarian amputees were carefully helped from the medical transports. The journey from the overcrowded prisoner camp in Louisiana had taken 18 hours, during which Laszlo had convinced himself that this transfer meant certain death. Hungarian soldiers who cooperated with the Americans, he'd heard whispered, were shot as traitors by their own countrymen. Those who didn't cooperate were shot by the Americans as enemies. Either way, a man with one leg wasn't much use to anyone in wartime. But unlike the horror stories they'd heard whispered in European camps, there were no barbed wire mazes stretching toward the horizon, no guard towers casting ominous shadows over rows of starving prisoners. Instead, wooden ramps, actual accessibility ramps, led to clean white buildings marked with red crosses, and American nurses waited with clipboards and expressions that seemed almost maternal in their gentleness. The contrast was so stark that Josef Nagy, who had lost his dominant hand to shrapnel, actually asked the interpreter if they were being taken to a hospital by mistake. Laszlo's wheelchair bumped slightly as Corporal Johnson pushed him toward the medical facility, navigating around patches of wildflowers that someone had actually bothered to plant and maintain. "Easy there, soldier," the American said in broken Hungarian he'd clearly been practicing with considerable effort. His pronunciation was terrible, but the intent was unmistakable. "We're going to take good care of you." The words hung in the air like an impossible promise. Laszlo stared up at the young medic's face, searching for mockery or cruelty, for the inevitable moment when kindness would reveal itself as a prelude to torture, but found only tired compassion that reminded him of his own father's eyes after long days in the fields. Behind him, Istvan was being wheeled by a nurse who was actually humming "You Are My Sunshine," as if this were any normal day at any normal hospital, as if the man in her care weren't an enemy soldier whose countrymen had killed her brothers and cousins across the Atlantic. Her name tag read Patricia Collins, RN, and she paused occasionally to point out features of the camp. "That's the commissary where you'll eat. They make excellent cornbread on Wednesdays. And that building there is the recreation hall. We have a radio, some books, even a piano if anyone plays." The intake process defied every expectation Laszlo had formed during his months of captivity. Instead of interrogations conducted under harsh lights with threats and intimidation, there were medical examinations performed with the same thoroughness he'd seen during his mandatory military physicals back in Hungary. Instead of punishment details designed to break spirits and bodies, there were rehabilitation schedules posted on bulletin boards like college course catalogues. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the camp's head physician, knelt beside Laszlo's wheelchair with the fluid motion of someone accustomed to treating patients as equals rather than subjects. "Where does it hurt most?" she asked in careful Hungarian, her pronunciation coached by the camp's interpreter, but delivered with genuine concern. When Laszlo hesitantly pointed to where his right leg had once been, she nodded knowingly and made detailed notes about phantom pain therapy. Her medical bag contained not instruments of torture, but familiar tools of healing: stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, reflex hammer. "We've learned a lot about helping soldiers adjust," she explained through the interpreter, a middle-aged Hungarian-American named Peter Szabo, who had volunteered for this assignment. American, German, Hungarian, Italian. Pain speaks the same language, and so does recovery. The medical examination revealed the full extent of Laszlo's injuries. The amputation had been performed under battlefield conditions by a Hungarian medic with limited supplies. The healing had been adequate but crude, leaving him with complications that proper medical attention could still address. Dr. Mitchell's notes included recommendations for revision surgery to improve prosthetic fitting, phantom pain management protocols, and psychological counseling to address what she termed adjustment disorder secondary to combat amputation. As evening approached and the prisoners were shown to clean beds with actual pillows, sheets that had been laundered with soap, and windows that opened to let in the warm Texas breeze, Laszlo found himself staring at the ceiling in complete disbelief. Through the window, he could hear American soldiers playing baseball in the distance, their laughter carrying on the evening air like music from another world. For the first time in months, his last conscious thought wasn't about survival, about rationing his energy for tomorrow's unknown horrors, but about possibility, the dangerous, terrifying possibility that perhaps he might actually live to see his farm again. The morning bell at 6 a.m. wasn't the harsh clang of prison routine. It was almost musical compared to the air raid sirens that had dominated Laszlo's recent memories. A gentle chime that seemed to suggest the start of opportunity rather than another day of endurance. As orderlies helped him into his wheelchair with patient efficiency, he noticed something extraordinary through the large windows. Other recovering prisoners were already working in what appeared to be a thriving vegetable garden, their movements careful but purposeful as they tended rows of tomatoes, peppers and corn under the supervision of an American agricultural specialist who was demonstrating proper irrigation techniques. Istvan rolled his chair over, shaking his head in amazement that had been building since their arrival. "They gave me breakfast," he whispered, glancing around as if expecting this miracle to be revoked at any moment. "Real eggs, Laszlo. Scrambled eggs with butter, actual coffee with sugar and bread that was baked this morning. When was the last time we saw real eggs? When was the last time anyone cared whether we were hungry?" His voice carried the wonder of a man rediscovering what it meant to be treated as human rather than cargo. The breakfast hall reinforced this sense of dignified treatment. Hungarian prisoners sat at the same tables as recovering American soldiers, sharing meals that had been prepared by the same kitchen staff. Conversation was limited by language barriers, but gestures of courtesy transcended words. American soldiers passing salt to Hungarian prisoners, Istvan helping a young American amputee reach his coffee cup, Josef demonstrating how to cut meat one-handed to a newly arrived German soldier who was struggling with the same challenge. Physical therapy began that afternoon in a converted barn that had been transformed into a modern rehabilitation center that rivaled anything Laszlo had seen in Budapest's best hospitals. The equipment was state-of-the-art by 1944 standards: parallel bars for gait training, weight machines adapted for amputee use, balance boards and exercise mats arranged in a space that emphasized healing rather than punishment. American soldiers who had lost limbs in the Pacific and European theaters worked alongside the Hungarian prisoners, sharing equipment and, gradually, stories that revealed the universal nature of their struggles. Sergeant Mike Torres, who'd lost his arm at Anzio, became Laszlo's informal mentor in those first crucial days. "First week's hell," he said through Peter Szabo's interpretation, his honest assessment delivered without sugarcoating but with the authority of lived experience. "You'll wake up reaching for things with a hand that ain't there, trying to walk on a leg that's gone. Your brain takes time to catch up with your body's new reality." He demonstrated navigating stairs with crutches, his movements fluid and confident after months of practice. "But look!" He hopped up 3 steps with surprising grace, then turned and descended backwards with equal skill. Your brain learns new tricks. You become a different kind of strong. Laszlo's first session with the prosthetic specialist, Lieutenant Patricia Hayes, challenged everything he thought he knew about enemy compassion and the value placed on enemy lives. She measured his residual limb with the same precision and care she would use for any American soldier, explaining each step of the process through the interpreter with technical expertise that assumed he was intelligent enough to understand and participate in his own treatment. "We're fitting you for a temporary prosthetic first," she said, carefully adjusting the plaster cast that would serve as the mold for his new limb. "This will let you begin walking while your residual limb continues to change shape. Once the swelling goes down completely and the tissue stabilizes, we'll make your permanent prosthetic. You'll be walking independently before Christmas." Walking. The word hung in the air like a promise Laszlo had never dared make to himself. A future that extended beyond mere survival to actual mobility, independence, dignity. Lieutenant Hayes showed him examples of the prosthetics produced by the camp's workshop. Lightweight devices crafted from aircraft aluminum and leather with articulated joints and cushioned interfaces that bore no resemblance to the crude wooden pegs he had expected. The afternoons brought occupational therapy sessions where prisoners learned to adapt daily tasks to their new realities under the guidance of specialists who treated these adaptations as skills to be mastered rather than limitations to be endured. Josef Nagy, who'd lost his dominant right hand to a grenade explosion, was learning to write with his left hand under the patient guidance of occupational therapist Mary Ellen Crawford, a former schoolteacher who had retrained in rehabilitation medicine specifically to help wounded soldiers. She had Josef practicing by copying letters to his family, letters that would actually be sent through the Red Cross rather than confiscated or destroyed, letters that represented actual communication with the world beyond the camp's boundaries. His first attempts were childlike scrawls that frustrated him to tears, but Mary Ellen's response was to adjust the pen grip and demonstrate letter formation as if he were any student learning any new skill. When Josef successfully wrote his 6-year-old daughter's name, Esther, in careful, shaky letters that nonetheless carried all the love of a father separated from his child, his eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with defeat or despair, but with the overwhelming realization that he might actually be able to communicate with her again, to write letters that she could read, to maintain the connection that war had threatened to sever permanently. Now tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day this story found you. It's fascinating to know how far these human memories travel. 3 weeks into their rehabilitation, Laszlo took his first step on American soil, literally and symbolically. The prosthetic leg that Lieutenant Hayes had crafted specifically for his anatomy felt foreign but functional, a marvel of engineering that represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor invested in the mobility of an enemy soldier. As he gripped the parallel bars in the therapy room, every eye in the facility seemed focused on this moment of triumph that transcended nationality and politics. Dr. Mitchell stood nearby with her clipboard, but her professional demeanor couldn't hide the smile that had become increasingly common among the staff as they witnessed daily miracles of human resilience. "Steady now," she encouraged in Hungarian that had improved significantly through daily practice with her patients. "Your body remembers how to balance. Trust the muscle memory that's still there." Her hands hovered near his waist, ready to catch him if he fell, but positioned to allow him the dignity of independent movement. The step was awkward, mechanical, nothing like the confident stride he'd once used to cross his family's wheat fields during harvest season. The prosthetic leg responded differently than flesh and bone, requiring conscious thought for movements that had once been automatic. But it was a step, and then another. The third step was slightly more natural. By the fifth step, Istvan was cheering from his wheelchair, and even the American soldiers stopped their own exercises to applaud this victory that belonged to all of them. Sergeant Torres called out, "That's the spirit, soldier!" And Laszlo understood the English well enough to nod his thanks, his face flushed with exertion and pride. The physical therapist, Captain Robert Hayes, Lieutenant Hayes's husband, as Laszlo would later learn, made notes about gait patterns and balance while maintaining a steady stream of encouragement. "Beautiful form," he said through the interpreter. "You're a natural. We'll have you running marathons by spring." The prosthetics workshop became Laszlo's second home, a place where engineering met artistry in service of human mobility. Unlike the crude wooden pegs he'd expected based on horror stories from other camps, the American-made limb was a marvel of wartime innovation. The socket was crafted from laminated wood and lined with leather, shaped precisely to his residual limb through multiple fittings that Lieutenant Hayes conducted with the patience of a master craftsman. The mechanical knee joint was spring-loaded and adjustable, allowing for different walking speeds and terrain adaptations. The foot was carved from lightweight maple and designed to flex naturally during the gait cycle. Lieutenant Hayes explained the maintenance routine with the thoroughness of someone who genuinely wanted him to succeed long after the war ended, long after he had returned to Hungary and was beyond American assistance. "This isn't just for now," she said through the interpreter, demonstrating how to adjust the straps, oil the joints, and replace worn components. "This is for your life after you go home. I'm teaching you to be your own prosthetist because I want you walking when you're 70 years old." Home. Another word that had started to carry weight again, to represent possibility rather than just memory. Yosef's progress was equally remarkable, though his challenges were different. The hand prosthetic was more basic than Laszlo's sophisticated leg, a hook attachment that he initially rejected as more machine than man, a surrender to disability rather than a tool for overcoming it. But occupational therapist Crawford worked with him daily, showing him how the device could grip, manipulate tools, even hold a coffee cup with surprising delicacy once he learned to control the cable system that operated the hook. The breakthrough came when she introduced him to the camp's woodworking shop, where several American amputees were crafting furniture and decorative items as part of their own rehabilitation. Yosef discovered that the hook attachment could grip wood-carving tools with a steadiness that his nervous left hand couldn't match. His first project was a simple wooden cross, but his second was a small horse that captured the memory of his family's farm with surprising detail. The day he successfully buttoned his own shirt, a task that had required assistance since his injury, Yosef wept openly in the occupational therapy room. "My wife," he said in broken English that he'd been learning from American patients. "She not have to dress me like child. I can be husband again, not burden." Istvan's case was more complex, requiring dual leg prosthetics and extensive balance training that pushed the rehabilitation program's capabilities. The American physical therapy team developed a specialized program just for him, using techniques they'd pioneered with their own double amputees from the Pacific Theater. Captain Robert Hayes, who had lost both legs in a training accident before the war, served as Istvan's primary mentor and living proof that full mobility was possible. "The first month, you'll hate everything," he said honestly during their initial consultation, his directness refreshing after weeks of well-meaning but vague encouragement. "You'll hate the prosthetics, you'll hate the exercises, you'll hate me for pushing you, and you'll hate yourself for needing help with things you used to do without thinking. The second month, you'll hate it all a little less. By the third month, you'll realize you're still the same man, just with different equipment." The physical training was grueling. Istvan had to relearn balance from the ground up, starting with sitting exercises and progressing through kneeling, standing, and finally walking. Each day brought small victories and frequent setbacks. Falls were common and painful, both physically and emotionally, but the American staff treated each fall as a learning opportunity rather than a failure. helping him analyze what went wrong and how to prevent it next time. The breakthrough came when Istvan successfully walked 50 feet without assistance, his gait awkward but determined as he navigated from the parallel bars to the far wall of the therapy room and back. The entire rehabilitation wing erupted in celebration. American staff, Hungarian prisoners, and recovering American soldiers united in recognition of human determination that transcended all boundaries of nationality and politics. That evening, Dr. Mitchell made a note in Istvan's file that would follow him back to Hungary. Patient has achieved full mobility independence. Prognosis for normal civilian life. Excellent. Recommend continued physical therapy and prosthetic maintenance. Patient demonstrates exceptional resilience and adaptation. He will walk for the rest of his life. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by the camp chaplain with unusual ceremony that indicated its importance beyond routine prisoner correspondence. Laszlo's hands shook as he opened the Red Cross envelope, the first communication from his family since his capture 6 months earlier, 6 months during which he had existed in a void of uncertainty about whether his wife and daughter even knew if he was alive or dead. His wife Maria had written in her careful script, the handwriting he remembered from love letters during their courtship. My dearest Laszlo, we received word through the Red Cross that you are wounded but alive and recovering in America. The farm still waits for you. I have kept the fields planted with help from your brothers, though the harvest is smaller without your strong hands. Anna asks every day when Papa is coming home to help with the planting season. She draws pictures of you every night before prayers and insists we set a place for you at dinner. But it was the final line that broke him completely. However you return to us, with one leg or two, strong or weak, we will be whole again, because families are not made of perfect bodies, but of perfect love. Come home to us, my husband, we are waiting. Doctor. Mitchell found him crying in the garden later that day, his new prosthetic leg stretched out before him as he sat on a wooden bench that the prisoners had built themselves as part of their occupational therapy. The garden had become a place of reflection for many of the patients, a space where men could process the emotional challenges of recovery away from the more clinical environments of the medical facilities. Good news or bad news? She asked gently, settling beside him with the easy familiarity that had developed over weeks of treatment, the professional boundaries softened by daily interaction and mutual respect. When he showed her the letter, she smiled with genuine warmth. She sounds like a wise woman. And she's right, you're still the same man who planted that wheat, who built that life, who earned that kind of love. The leg you lost doesn't change any of that. The psychological rehabilitation program at Camp Hearn was as revolutionary as the physical therapy, representing a new understanding of trauma and recovery that would later influence Veterans Administration programs for decades. Captain James Morrison, a former psychology professor turned Army psychiatrist, had developed group sessions specifically for amputee prisoners that addressed not just the physical challenges of limb loss, but the complex emotional and psychological adjustments required for successful reintegration into civilian life. Unlike interrogations or political re-education, these meetings focused on adaptation, acceptance, and hope. The sessions were conducted in a comfortable room with armchairs arranged in a circle, more like a living room than a medical facility. Your injury doesn't define your worth, Captain Morrison would say through the interpreter, his words carefully chosen to address the shame and self-doubt that plagued every amputee. Your response to it defines your character. And what I see in this room is character that would impress any man in any country. The group sessions revealed common struggles that transcended nationality. German, Hungarian, Italian, and American amputees shared similar nightmares, similar fears about returning home, similar anger at their changed circumstances. Josef found himself comforting a young German soldier who had lost his leg at the same age. while Istvan shared coping strategies with an American Marine who was struggling with dual amputation. Josef had been struggling with phantom pain in his missing hand, waking up screaming from dreams where he could still feel his fingers burning from the grenade explosion that had claimed them. The phantom sensations were so vivid that he would look down, expecting to see his hand intact, only to be shocked anew by its absence. Captain Morrison introduced him to meditation techniques and phantom limb exercises that seemed almost mystical in their effectiveness. "The pain is real," Morrison explained during one of their individual sessions, his approach combining medical knowledge with psychological insight. "But it's also a conversation between your brain and a limb that's no longer there. Your brain is still sending signals to muscles and nerves that don't exist, and when those signals don't get the responses they expect, they interpret that as pain. We can teach your brain new conversations." Indeed, the technique involved visualization exercises where Josef would imagine moving his missing fingers, combined with sensory stimulation of his residual limb using different textures and temperatures. Over weeks of practice, the phantom pain diminished from constant agony to occasional discomfort, and finally to rare twinges that he could manage without medication. The most surprising therapy came in the form of work assignments that differed radically from the forced labor common in other prisoner camps. Rather than punishment details designed to break spirits, the prisoners were offered paid positions, actual wages, though modest, assisting in the camp's operations. The work was voluntary, meaningful, and designed to rebuild skills and confidence rather than exploit vulnerability. Laszlo found himself helping in the prosthetics workshop, learning to craft the same devices that had given him mobility. His steady hands and attention to detail, honed by years of precision farming and equipment maintenance, made him invaluable to Lieutenant Hayes's team. He learned to shape wood, work leather, adjust metal joints, and fit prosthetics to other patients with the same care that had been shown to him. "You have a gift for this," Lieutenant Hayes told him one afternoon, as he perfectly fitted a leg brace for a newly arrived American amputee, his work demonstrating both technical skill and intuitive understanding of patient needs. "Have you ever considered this as a profession after the war? There will be thousands of men who need these services, and trained prosthetists will be desperately needed." The suggestion planted a seed that would grow into Laszlo's post-war career, but more immediately it gave him a sense of purpose that transcended his own recovery. He was not just healing, he was helping others heal, contributing something valuable rather than simply receiving charity. Istvan became the unofficial mentor for new amputee arrivals, regardless of nationality. His fluent German allowed him to communicate with captured Wehrmacht soldiers, while his improving English helped him assist American wounded who were struggling with the same challenges he had mastered. His room became an informal counseling center, where newly arrived patients could see living proof that full mobility was possible. The day he successfully taught a young American Marine how to navigate stairs with dual prosthetics, Captain Hayes pulled him aside for a conversation that would reshape Istvan's understanding of his own value. "You're not just healing," he said through the interpreter, his voice carrying the respect of one professional recognizing another. "You're healing others. You've become a teacher, a counselor, a source of hope for men who thought they had none. That's the finest medicine there is." December snow dusted the Texas plains, a meteorological rarity that the staff insisted was good luck, a sign that even the weather was celebrating the progress made by the men in their care. Laszlo stood at the workshop window, watching Istvan demonstrate prosthetic maintenance to a group of newly arrived German amputees, his patient explanations delivered in fluent German, while his hands showed the proper techniques for leather conditioning and joint lubrication. His own mobility had progressed to the point where he could walk nearly normally, the slight mechanical gait barely noticeable to casual observers and certainly not limiting in any practical sense. More importantly, his confidence had returned, not just in his physical abilities, but in his fundamental worth as a human being. When he caught his reflection in the workshop window, he saw not a broken prisoner or a burden to society, but a man ready to rebuild his life, a skilled craftsman with valuable knowledge, a husband and father, prepared to resume his roles with dignity intact. The prosthetics workshop had become his domain, where he worked alongside Lieutenant Hayes to create mobility solutions for a steady stream of wounded soldiers from multiple nations. His specialization was fitting and adjustment, the delicate process of ensuring that each prosthetic matched its user's anatomy and lifestyle needs. American soldiers praised his attention to detail, while German and Hungarian patients appreciated his ability to communicate in their native languages about the intimate challenges of limb loss. Lieutenant Hayes had submitted paperwork recommending Laszlo for advanced training in prosthetics manufacturing, a program that would extend his stay in America but provide him with skills that would be invaluable in post-war Europe. There will be thousands of men who need these services, she explained during one of their planning sessions, and trained prosthetists will be desperately needed. You could help establish rehabilitation programs in Hungary, maybe even in other countries. You could turn your injury into a way of serving others who face the same challenges. The farewell preparations began in January 1945. As the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion and plans for prisoner repatriation took concrete form. Unlike the desperate uncertainty of their arrival, the prisoners now faced repatriation with detailed medical files, extra prosthetic parts, and comprehensive care instructions translated into Hungarian. Each man leaving Camp Herne would carry documentation that would help Hungarian doctors continue their treatment and proof of the skills they had learned during their rehabilitation. Dr. Mitchell personally reviewed each case, ensuring that every man would have the resources needed for continued recovery back home. "This isn't goodbye to your treatment," she explained to the assembled group during their final medical review. "This is graduation to independence. You've learned to manage your prosthetics, to maintain your equipment, to recognize problems before they become serious. You're not just survivors, you're experts in your own care." Josef had become so proficient with his prosthetic hook that he'd started carving wooden toys in the workshop, gifts for the daughter he hadn't seen in over a year, items that would prove to her that her father could still create beautiful things despite his injury. His latest creation, a small horse that matched the ones he remembered from his family's farm, sat proudly on Lieutenant Hayes's desk, where it served as inspiration for other patients struggling with fine motor control. "For your kindness," he'd written in careful English on an accompanying note that represented months of language study with American patients. "From one parent to another, thank you for helping me become a father again, instead of just a patient." The gift represented more than gratitude. It was proof of capability, evidence that his hands could still create rather than merely adapt. The woodworking shop had become Josef's second workshop, where he crafted furniture and decorative items that would furnish his family's home upon his return. Each piece demonstrated not just skill, but hope. A dining table that assumed the family would gather for meals, a toy chest that anticipated children's laughter, a jewelry box that presumed his wife would again have occasions for beauty rather than mere survival. The most emotional moment came during the final group therapy session, where Captain Morrison had arranged for each prisoner to write a letter to their future selves, messages to be opened in 5 years, regardless of what the post-war world might bring. The exercise was designed to crystallize the psychological growth they had achieved and create a tangible connection between their current optimism and whatever challenges awaited them. Laszlo's letter was simple but profound. "Dear future Laszlo, if you are reading this in 1950, remember the Texas sun that warmed your face during recovery. Remember that enemies can become healers when they choose compassion over vengeance. Remember that you are more than what you lost. You are defined by what you chose to do with what remained. If times are hard, remember that Americans believed in your worth when you had stopped believing in it yourself. If you have become bitter, remember Lieutenant Hayes's patient hands teaching you to walk again. If you have forgotten how to hope, remember Istvan's laughter when he took his first steps. You survived not just war, but the loss of hope itself. Whatever 1950 brings, you have already proven that you can rebuild anything. Istvan's departure speech, delivered in a mixture of Hungarian, German, and broken English, to accommodate the international audience that had gathered to see them off, captured what they'd all experienced. We came here as broken men expecting punishment or death. We leave as whole human beings who learned that healing has no nationality, that compassion recognizes no flag, that humanity is stronger than hatred. The American doctors and nurses didn't just fix our bodies, they fixed our faith in the future. His words were translated for the American staff, many of whom were visibly moved by this acknowledgement from men they had come to see, not as enemies but as patients, colleagues and friends. The applause that followed was spontaneous and prolonged, a recognition of shared achievement that transcended the political circumstances that had brought them together. On the morning of their departure, something unprecedented happened that would be remembered by camp staff for decades afterward. The American medical staff, from Dr. Mitchell down to the orderlies who had pushed wheelchairs and carried meal trays, lined up to shake hands with each departing prisoner. This wasn't protocol or military courtesy, it was personal farewell between people who had shared an extraordinary experience of healing and hope. Dr. Mitchell presented Laszlo with a wooden cane, carved by one of the American patients, not because he needed it for mobility, but as a symbol of support that would always be available to him, regardless of distance or circumstance. The cane was inscribed with a simple message: "From Texas to Hungary, you always have friends." Lieutenant Hayes gave Joseph a comprehensive maintenance kit for his prosthetic, but also a small American flag. "So you remember," she said through the interpreter, "that somewhere in Texas, people are rooting for your success for the rest of your life." Captain Morrison's gift to Istvan was a leather-bound journal filled with blank pages. "For writing your new story," he explained, "the one that begins with, 'I learned to walk again in America, and then I went home to help others do the same.'" No. The journal would become Istvan's constant companion, filled with notes about prosthetic techniques, patient counseling strategies, and memories of the place where he had rediscovered his worth as a human being. If this story moved you, hit the like button. It helps Laszlo's story reach more people and reminds us what war tried to erase: our shared humanity. The train that carried them toward the East Coast and eventual repatriation was nothing like the cattle cars of their capture, nothing like the overcrowded transports that had brought them across the Atlantic as prisoners. These were passenger cars with cushioned seats and windows they could actually see through, with dining cars where they would eat meals prepared by civilian staff who treated them as customers rather than captives. As the Texas landscape rolled past, the same plains where they had learned to walk again, the same sky under which they had rediscovered hope, Laszlo placed his hand on his prosthetic leg and smiled. The limb no longer felt foreign. It had become part of him, as much a part of his identity as his memories of home. He was going home not as a broken prisoner carrying the shame of defeat, but as a man who had witnessed proof that compassion could survive even the cruelest circumstances. Istvan sat across from him, already planning the rehabilitation center he would establish in Budapest, sketching designs for prosthetic workshops and training programs in the journal Captain Morrison had given him. Joseph worked on a wooden toy, his hook attachment manipulating the carving tools with the precision of a master craftsman, creating beauty from simple materials through skill and patience. Years later, Laszlo would tell his grandchildren about the American doctors who taught him to walk again, not because military regulations required it, not because political considerations demanded it, but because they believed every human deserved the chance to stand tall. In his workshop in post-war Hungary, where he crafted prosthetics for other veterans using techniques learned in Texas, he kept a photograph from Camp Hern, 12 Hungarian soldiers standing proudly on artificial limbs, surrounded by the American medical team that had refused to see them as anything less than men worth saving. The photograph became famous in prosthetic circles across Europe, reprinted in medical journals and rehabilitation manuals as proof that healing could transcend politics, that the highest medical ethics involved treating patients as human beings first and everything else second. But for Laszlo, Istvan, and Josef, it was simply a reminder of the place where they had learned that losing a limb didn't mean losing hope, that being an enemy didn't preclude being worthy of care, and that sometimes the most important victories happen not on battlefields, but in physical therapy rooms, where former enemies learn to walk together toward a better future. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part touched you most. Because sometimes peace begins when we retell the past with empathy, when we remember that even in war's darkest moments, human compassion found ways to shine through the hatred and illuminate the path back to our shared humanity.